Come to John on John, chapter 7 we're looking at tonight. And the subject is faith and reason. And I don't think that's actually the main point of the chapter. But because we're looking at the Gospel of John from a modern perspective, I hope that this will help us to kind of examine the presuppositions and the things that we bring when we approach the text and we try to make sense of Jesus and matters of faith, because in the passage we see how different groups of people come to Jesus and their assessment of him. And there are quite a lot of things that I think are in common with the way that we do today. When we ask the question, what is faith? A lot of times in the world that we live in, people will say that faith is believing what you cannot see. It's proving what you can't know by normal means. And therefore it's a kind of irrational gut feeling and intuition. And it's not really something that respectable intellectual people should take seriously. It's for the credulous, people who are easily persuaded, people who are gullible and naive. Someone said faith is for dummies. Well, I don't think that's necessarily a true way of looking at faith. But I do want to kind of just explore the relationship between faith and reason. Leslie Stevens said, "The division between faith and reason is a half measure till it's frankly admitted that faith has to do with fiction and reason to do with fact." Now, there's a lot of people in the world today who just approach the gospel like that. They assume that what we're talking about isn't real, isn't history, didn't happen, and it's certainly not to do with fact. That's the scientific world that we live in. The fictitious world of faith is like believing in fairies at the bottom of the garden. However, the church has consistently held that faith takes us not into a realm that is unknown to other people, because every day people exercise faith. Every time you sit in a chair, you trust that it's going to hold you up. Every time you spend money, people believe that what you give, those little coins and bits of paper or some electronic transfer, is worth substance. We trust people that we've never met, that we've never seen. We believe that history is real. We believe that we can truly know things. We are not skeptics at heart. We do exercise faith, quite outside of a kind of religious or spiritual dimension. Thomas Aquinas, who was a medieval theologian and philosopher, he says, faith is not opposed to reason, but it's higher than reason. Faith takes us beyond reason. Therefore, when we come to Jesus and when we try to make sense of him, we are not simply looking at what we might say a logical argument. There is logic, but there's also sentiment. There's intuition and there's intellect. And those two help us to really comprehend more fully. When you're in a relationship, you get to know a person, but you also develop feelings about the person. And a true knowledge in a relationship incorporates both facts and feelings. Particularly, you'd want that in a romantic relationship. You can't have a whole relationship, not just with common understanding, but also common feelings that germinate a love. So faith operates in that kind of way. Blaise Pascal, who was a French mathematician, he says the supreme function of reason is to show man that some things are beyond reason. You can only go so far with reason. And we need imagination. We need the arts and music to take us into realms of comprehension that just a scientific textbook and a paper explaining something won't take us. There's a holistic kind of approach to life. Now, in John chapter 7, we see different groups of people who come to Jesus, and they got their thoughts and they got their feelings. And there's a mix of thought and feeling in the way that they approach who Jesus is. And it starts, John 7 is Jesus going into Galilee, and the brothers, his brothers, and you'll notice in verse 5, at this point, his brothers didn't believe him. Their assessment of Jesus was not, oh yeah, he's the Son of God, we've always known that. No, they were on their own journey. Their thoughts and feelings must have been very strange, having lived in the same house as Jesus. They didn't believe. And Jesus was considering whether or not to go up to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles, one of the 3 annual feasts of the Jews. And his his brothers urge him to go. Leave here. In verse 3 they say, leave here and go to Judea so that your disciples may see the works you're doing. So what they're saying is, look, if you really want to get your message across, what you need is good publicity. And what better publicity opportunity than to go up to the Feast of Tabernacles, where all the kind of important people, all the religious people within the Jewish world are likely to be there. There you can really make your mark. Show yourself to the world. But actually they themselves weren't believers. Now Jesus is aware that it's not just a case of him going up there and speaking a few words or even performing a few signs. That's not going to persuade people to follow him and trust him, and the result of it is not going to be that the whole of the nation simply become followers and believers in Jesus. He says, you go up to the feast. I'm not going up to the feast, for my time has not fully come. You've got a certain way of looking at things. You think the time is now, and you think this is how it's going to be done. But believe me, there's a complicated situation going on here. He says, the world cannot hate you, but the world hates me because I testify that its works are evil. Jesus says he's exposing darkness, and the darkness is reacting. And when that happens, rather than people just saying, oh yeah, we accept your claims, Jesus, they resist. They resist because Jesus requires changes, moral changes, spiritual changes. And the people aren't willing to yield and to accommodate him. It's not a straightforward matter. You go up to the feast, he says. I am not going to this feast, for my time has not yet fully come. And he stayed in Galilee for a while, but then he decides he will go. And so he goes up to Jerusalem. The next way that we could look at the relationship between faith and reason is, what's the word on the street? Because people are making their minds up. People are developing opinions. They're getting thoughts and facts and feelings, and it's all merging in. And there's a buzz around the streets of Jerusalem as Jesus makes his presence known. People are talking about him. They have heard about the things that he has been doing and saying. And here's the kind of things that are reflected in verses 12 and 14 of John chapter 7. He's a good man. Others are saying he's leading people astray. Others are saying he's the prophet. Some are saying he's the Christ. And still others are saying he has a demon. Now, I think that's, if you were to do a straw poll around the streets of the area you live, you'd find that there's a range of thoughts and opinions and feelings about who Jesus is. It's just out there. It's not necessarily right. It's not necessarily wrong. There's truth in some of the things that the people are saying. But often what we find is that people will modify the information. They'll filter out things from the claims of Jesus, and they'll kind of dial it back to suit their own presuppositions. For example, in verse 12, it says that there were people saying, he's a good man. He's a good man. Well, Jesus was claiming not to be a good man, but he was claiming to be a man sent from God. Not just a man raised up by God, but one who'd pre-existence, one who'd come from heaven. In fact, he was claiming that he was God in human form, as we saw last week. I am the bread of life. He uses the name of God 7 times, and supremely in the next chapter, which we'll look at next week, where he says, before Abraham was, I am. Now, good man, generally speaking, does not say things of that kind of nature. He's not just a moral teacher. Sure, he is a moral teacher. Sure, he has had a massive impact in the ethics of world history, in the foundation of nations, and in the way in which they have operated, their values. But Jesus can't fit within the narrow confines of just being a good man. And yet we will find people who will filter Jesus. They'll say, well, of course, we can't believe in the supernatural, so we don't believe that Jesus was a miracle worker. Or if he was, he was a charlatan. No, we mustn't just accommodate Jesus. We must give him a fair listening and hear what he says and look at what he does in order to make our mind up. And then in verse 32, there's what we might call the party line, the official position. And here you've got a kind of different perspective and set of presuppositions. The Pharisees heard the crowd muttering these things about him. There was a lot of muttering going on in Jerusalem about Jesus. And the chief priests and Pharisees sent officers to arrest him. So whatever Jesus is saying, he's not getting a fair hearing from the Pharisees and the chief priests. They've made their minds up. This muttering, these people out there who are saying he's a good man, he's the prophet, he's the Christ. This could go badly wrong for the status quo. This could go badly wrong for the Pharisees in their official position. Therefore, they not only let it not be known that they don't accept Jesus' claims and seek to bring their influence, but they seek to have him arrested. And then finally in verse 50, there's a mention here of Nicodemus, the man who came to Jesus by night and to whom Jesus said, you must be born again. And he's still hovering in the background there, mulling over the things that he's seen and heard and wondering what to make of Jesus. And he says to the Pharisees, look, we should be not seeking to arrest him, not seeking to kill him. But they say to him, have any of the authorities or the Pharisees believed in him? This crowd does not know the law is accursed. Nicodemus said to them, Nicodemus, who had gone to him before and who was one of them, said, does our law judge a man without first giving him a hearing and learning what he does? They replied, are you from Galilee too? Search and see that no prophet arises from Galilee. So there's 2 things there. Nicodemus is kind of just holding back. He's agnostic. He's inconclusive. He hasn't come to a firm decision. He's saying, come on, but we do need to give this man a hearing. But the Pharisees have already made their minds up. Are you from Galilee too, they said. Search and see that no prophet arises from Galilee. Well, Jesus came from Galilee because he lived there, but he was born in Bethlehem. They haven't understood the facts. And again, we find there's many people who have made their mind up about Jesus without looking into the facts. That's unreasonable, because unless you've looked at the facts and the claims of Jesus and listened to them carefully, you're not in a position to really evaluate. So there's a lot of unreasonable response to Jesus that's out there. But Jesus is saying that even if we sit down round a table, even if we talk in the family, even if we have a warm audience, the gospel is never proclaimed in a neutral setting. It wasn't then, and it resulted in the crucifixion, and it isn't now. Jesus detected this undercurrent of hostility, even to the point of murder. And people coming to faith in Jesus today should be aware that there may be some kind of cost, some kind of backlash, some kind of negative reaction. Not everyone is going to congratulate you if you become a follower of Jesus. Not everyone is going to agree with you. Some people will think that you have lost your mind. Some people may ridicule you. Well, that's what they did to Jesus. And Jesus was aware of it, and yet he persisted in asserting his claims. The verse that says, there was much muttering about him among the people. Some said he's a good man. Others said, no, he's leading people astray. Yet for fear of the Jews, no one spoke openly about him. Now, the Pharisees were seeking to kill him. We know that in the end, that was what happened to Jesus. It's not reasonable. That's not a way of assessing the claims of Jesus, but it's how some people operate. Coming to a true, deep faith in Jesus often takes time, but it always requires an open heart. And Jesus knows that unless people are open, then they are not going to come to faith. He says in verse 17, if anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own authority. So Jesus is looking for sincerity. He's looking for people who are looking for God. And he's saying, actually, if you're not looking for God, you're probably not going to want to be persuaded. You're not probably not spiritually open. And therefore, you are going to find reasons why you're not going to respond, why you're not going to believe. Reasons for faith are important, but Jesus is not simply out there to answer intellectual questions. Even this question of where he was born, he doesn't seem to clear it up. He just leaves it there. And often it's been said that Jesus doesn't always answer the question, he answers the questioner. And if someone is hostile, they won't hear the answer. But if you're sincere, you can find him. Are there things that stop you coming to faith in Jesus? Are you sincere in your seeking of God? Are you ready for the consequences, for the commitment of faith? Are you ready for maybe a change of life, a change of values? This could affect your sexuality. It could affect your finances. It could be that God will call you to leave your present job and go somewhere else and do something else for him. It could be all kinds of things that God is calling for you to do. Because Jesus is calling for disciples, not just for people to say, okay, tick box, he is the Son of God. Tick box, he died for my sins. Tick box, he rose from the dead. Faith is evidenced in love and in obedience in a life of sacrifice. The second thing is that in verse 37, Jesus stands up at the Feast of Tabernacles. They had a water pouring ceremony. Jesus stands up on the last day, the great day of the feast, and he cried out, if anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. And he still calls to people, not just, do you understand, do you believe? But come if you're thirsty. Come if you're ready for God. He said in the passage we looked at last week, I'm the bread of life. Now he's offering living water, a spiritual water, something that will satisfy the longings, not just of your mind, but of your heart. He won't answer all the questions. If you're just curious about Jesus and want to know a few things, you're probably going to be frustrated. But if your heart is to know God, you will know that his teaching is from God, and you will find a relationship with Jesus is the answer to your faith. Well, I'd love you to talk in the groups and ask questions about the relationship between faith and reason, what goes on in a person. Maybe you could examine some of those verses and consider what was really behind the way that these people assessed Jesus. How did Jesus respond? What's been your experience personally? Or what have you seen in other people in the way that they've responded? Is your faith unreasonable? Do you think faith is unreasonable? Do you think it's irrational? Do you think faith is for dummies? Or have you come to see that faith is a part of everybody's experience, and trusting in God is part of the way in which we are restored into a right relationship? Are you hungry and thirsty for that? If you are, then Jesus will meet you and change your life.